There was a time when Orange County choppers looked like it could never run out of road. A father and his sons built million-dollar motorcycles in front of television cameras, screamed at each other over deadlines, and somehow turned all of that noise into one of the biggest reality shows on cable. For almost a decade, American Chopper made the Teutul name synonymous with custom steel, chrome, and family chaos. But television only shows the highlight reel. It never shows what happens after the crew packs up the cameras and the ratings start to slide. What actually happened to the Teutuls and to the builders who stood next to them in that Newburgh, New York shop is a much messier story than anything that ever aired on Discovery Channel. And in some ways, it's still being written today. People forget just how unlikely the whole thing was in the first place. Reality television in the early 2000s was mostly built around competitions, dating shows, and stage drama on tropical islands. Nobody expected a family-owned steel shop in upstate New York to become one of the most talked-about programs on cable. And yet American Chopper did exactly that, almost by accident, because the cameras happened to be pointed at a family that genuinely couldn't stop fighting with each other in front of them. That authenticity, messy, loud, occasionally embarrassing, is exactly what made the show impossible to look away from. It also meant that when things eventually fell apart behind the scenes, they fell apart just as publicly in court filings and bankruptcy documents instead of on a soundstage. Before there was a television show, there was Orange County Iron Works, a steel fabrication business Paul Teutul Sr. built with his own hands after coming home from serving in the Merchant Marine during the Vietnam War era. He didn't grow up wealthy. By his own account, his childhood home was a difficult one, and he channeled a lot of that energy into welding, fixing bicycles, and eventually structural steelwork. Ironworks paid the bills for years before Paul Sr.'s obsession with custom motorcycles took over. In 1999, he broke away to start Orange County Choppers alongside his oldest son, Paul Jr., leaving the steel business behind in the hands of his other son, Daniel. Nobody in that garage had any idea that within 3 years, a Discovery Channel crew would show up and turn their arguments into national television. American Chopper premiered in 2002 and exploded almost overnight. Audiences didn't just want to see motorcycles get built. They wanted to see Paul Sr. and Paul Jr. go at each other, red-faced and screaming, over a deadline or a design choice. It was raw, it was uncomfortable, and it worked. OCC became a tourist attraction. Corporate clients lined up to commission theme bikes. For a few years, it genuinely looked like the family had built something that would last forever. Then the show's ratings began to fade. The custom bike market that had fueled the whole business cooled off dramatically after the 2008 financial crash, and slowly, the empire that looked untouchable on screen started coming apart at the seams for every single person who had a hand in building it. Paul Sr. was the face of the show, and he was also the one who absorbed the worst of the financial fallout. In March 2018, he filed for Chapter 13 bankruptcy in a New York court. The filing told a story the cameras never captured, roughly $1.07 million in listed debts against about $1.8 million in assets, a monthly income of around $15,000 from his steel fabrication work, and monthly expenses north of $12,600. His own attorney described the move as a proactive step rather than something forced by an emergency. But the numbers made clear that the man once running a multi-million-dollar operation was suddenly living much closer to the edge than fans ever imagined. The bankruptcy wasn't an isolated event either. A year earlier, in 2017, Paul Sr.'s business partner at the time, Thomas Derbyshire, filed a lawsuit accusing him of misusing money meant for a new television venture. That case dragged the family's finances into public court records yet again, on top of everything else already piling up. Around the same period, a federal court also found Paul Sr. in contempt for failing to pay a New York performance shop for work done on one of his personal vehicles, and separately, he was hit with a substantial back tax bill tied to his Crawford, New York property. None of it was a single knockout blow. It was closer to a slow accumulation of smaller wounds that eventually forced him to give up the massive New York headquarters that had become as much a character on the show as any of the people. By 2020, Paul Sr. relocated operations to Clearwater, Florida, where he opened a smaller OCC museum, restaurant, and event space called the OCC Roadhouse in partnership with local businessman Keith Overton. It wasn't the sprawling shop from the show's glory years, but it gave him a physical base to keep building and to keep the brand alive in front of fans. That new chapter hasn't been free of controversy either. Reporting from the Miami Herald has connected Paul Sr. to allegations that a group of Central American investors were misled about tens of millions of dollars they believed was legitimate seed funding for the Roadhouse project, a claim that adds yet another complicated layer to his post-show story. It's worth pausing on just how public that decline really was. Everything about Paul Sr.'s image on television was built around control. Control of the shop floor, control of every design decision, control of his son's work. Watching that same man list nearly 50 separate creditors in a bankruptcy filing, or lose a beloved personal property to foreclosure, was a genuinely jarring contrast for longtime viewers. The show had spent years selling the idea that OCC was untouchable. The paperwork told a completely different story, one where a business built on television fame had quietly stopped generating enough real revenue to support the lifestyle the cameras had captured. What might surprise longtime fans most, though, is that Paul Sr. hasn't faded away. He's actually building a second act. He's active on YouTube through his own channel. He still designs and promotes new OCC projects out of Florida. And heading into 2026, he returned to network television by hosting a new Discovery Channel series. Estimates of his current net worth vary wildly depending on the source, ranging from the low hundreds of thousands up into the multi-million-dollar range, which itself tells you how murky his post-bankruptcy finances really are. What's not in dispute is that the man who once ruled the loudest shop on cable television is still out there in his mid-70s, welding, filming, and refusing to disappear quietly. Of everyone connected to the original show, Paul Jr. arguably ended up in the strongest position, but he had to survive a brutal family legal battle to get there. In 2008, a blow-up on camera ended with Paul Sr. firing his own son, because Jr. still held a 20% ownership stake in Orange County Choppers. The split turned into a courtroom fight rather than a clean break. Paul Sr. tried to force a buyout using a clause in their partnership agreement, and the appraiser he hired valued Jr.'s stake at $0, a number that stunned fans watching the drama unfold on television. The case eventually landed in front of a judge, who ruled in December 2010 that the buyout terms were too vague to be enforced. Jr. kept his ownership stake, but the relationship with his father was effectively shattered. Rather than fight to stay inside OCC, Paul Jr. walked away and started fresh in 2009 with Paul Jr. Designs, based across the river in New Jersey before eventually settling back in the Montgomery, New York area. For a while, it looked like he might simply be trading one struggling shop for another. The custom motorcycle market that had made OCC famous was already shrinking, and money was tighter industry-wide than it had been during the show's early seasons. Like his father, Paul Jr. filed for Chapter 13 bankruptcy in 2018, listing assets and debts in the range of $1.8 million each, including unpaid tax obligations. But unlike some of the other post-show stories, Jr.'s didn't end in decline. Paul Jr. Designs pivoted away from being purely a custom chopper shop into a broader design and fabrication studio, building everything from themed motorcycles to corporate art installations and branded displays for major companies. He's picked up marquee clients along the way, including large entertainment and media companies looking for bespoke builds and branded pieces. Today, he runs an active shop with real employees, posts build videos for a loyal online fan base, and by most accounts has built a quieter, steadier life than the one that made him famous. One centered on family and a business he actually controls, rather than one built to satisfy a television network shooting schedule. There's a certain irony in how Junior's story played out. On the show, he was constantly framed as the son who couldn't measure up to his father's authority, the one who needed to be reined in creatively and financially. In reality, he's arguably the one Teutul who took the hardest hit, losing his ownership fight, getting publicly valued at $0 by his own father's hired appraiser, and still came out the other side running the more financially resilient business. He married in 2010, has built a family life well outside the tabloid churn that once surrounded him, and by several accounts has deliberately kept his current operation smaller and more manageable than OCC ever was, precisely so it wouldn't collapse under the same pressures that broke his father's company. If Paul Sr. was the temper and Paul Jr. was the talent, Mikey Teutul was the release valve. He was the one cracking jokes when his father and brother were screaming at each other, the guy fans related to because he wasn't trying to prove anything. What most viewers didn't see was that Mikey was fighting his own private battle the entire time. Away from the cameras, his drinking became a serious problem, and it eventually became impossible to ignore. His screen time shrank noticeably in later seasons, and it wasn't because producers lost interest in him. It was because his life outside the shop had started to unravel. Paul Sr. eventually removed Mikey from the business altogether, a decision that, by most accounts, became the wake-up call Mikey needed. He entered treatment and worked to get his life back on track, away from the show and away from the spotlight that had turned his personal struggles into a footnote in someone else's story. Even as he was rebuilding, more trouble found him. In 2019, a professional photographer sued Mikey, Paul Sr., and Orange County Choppers over the unauthorized use of copyrighted photographs on merchandise, including branded T-shirts and hoodies sold to fans. A federal judge sided with the photographer in 2020, ordering a payout north of $250,000, a costly reminder that the legal fallout from the show's fame didn't stop just because the cameras had moved on. Mikey's financial picture took its own hits too. A home he'd purchased from his mother years earlier ended up selling at a loss when he moved on from it, and by his own accounts his net worth shrank considerably from its earlier peak. Still, of everyone connected to the Teutul name, Mikey's story reads less like a collapse and more like a slow, deliberate rebuild. He returned to Orange County Choppers in a much smaller capacity, handling social media and spokesperson-type duties rather than building bikes. He also leaned hard into painting, selling original artwork through gallery shows and opening his own small art gallery in Montgomery, New York. He keeps a relatively low public profile these days, married and largely out of the tabloid churn, which, considering where he started, might be the most successful outcome of anyone from the original cast. It's easy to overlook Mikey's story next to the louder financial collapses that hit his father and older brother, but in a lot of ways his arc is the most human one in the entire cast. He wasn't fighting over a business valuation or a headquarters building. He was fighting an addiction that the show never once addressed directly while it was happening, choosing instead to quietly shrink his screen time rather than acknowledge what viewers were actually seeing. That he came out the other side with a stable marriage, a functioning gallery, and a role at the company that once let him go says more about personal resilience than anything a courtroom judgment ever could. The Teutul family dominated the headlines, but some of the most skilled hands in that shop belonged to people who never carried the family name. And their stories say just as much about what happened to the custom bike industry as anything that happened to Paul Sr. or his sons. Vinny DiMartino was widely considered one of the most talented builders on the crew before he left OCC in 2007 after 5 years on the job. His exit became infamous in fan circles thanks to Paul Sr.'s blunt public response that essentially amounted to everyone's replaceable. Vinny went on to open his own shop, V-Force Customs, but the timing could not have been worse. The 2008 financial crash gutted the market for expensive custom motorcycles almost overnight, and high-end chopper builds became a luxury very few customers could still justify. The shop eventually closed, and Vinny shifted into general automotive and truck repair work instead, trading show business fame for a steady, if far less glamorous, way to keep working with his hands. Rick Petco spent well over a decade commuting long distances just to be part of the OCC crew, collecting a per-episode fee on top of his regular pay. Eventually, the grind of the travel and the chaos of the shop simply wore him down, and he walked away to return home, taking a job with a Harley-Davidson dealership before eventually starting his own small business crafting custom knives and jewelry. It's a quiet, almost invisible career move compared to national television fame, but by most accounts it's given him something the show never could: a stable life where work doesn't swallow everything else. Cody Connolly might have the most unusual story of the bunch. He joined the shop as a young teenager and became, for a while, the youngest recognizable face on American reality television. That fame came with complications. He eventually took legal action against the shop over the use of his image and a custom motorcycle he says he was promised but never fully received, a dispute that was resolved quietly years later. Cody left the motorcycle world behind entirely and moved into an entirely different industry, running his own excavation and land-clearing business in upstate New York, about as far from television soundstage as a career can get. Jason Pohl joined the show, bringing a more digital, design-forward sensibility to the builds, but he often found himself the target of criticism from both fans and colleagues who felt his futuristic concepts didn't fit the shop's traditional style. He stayed with the brand for years, gradually stepping back as the business's financial troubles mounted, and eventually left the company entirely. He's since relocated to Florida and works in a design software-adjacent role, a career that draws on his design background without any of the reality television baggage attached to it. What ties all four of these builders together isn't fame or fortune. It's the fact that none of them tried to chase the OCC name once they left. Vinny went back to wrenches and general repair work. Rick picked up jewelry and knife making. Cody moved into heavy equipment and land clearing. Jason moved into software. Every single one of them pivoted into something completely unrelated to custom motorcycles, which says a lot about just how thoroughly the custom chopper market had dried up by the time they were making their exits. There simply wasn't a version of that industry left to rebuild a career inside of, so they built new careers instead. Here's the part of this story most casual fans never hear about, because the person at the center of it was never actually a cast member. Daniel Teutul, Paul Sr.'s second oldest son, took over the original family business, Orange County Ironworks, back in 2004, while his father and brother were busy becoming television celebrities.